It's very difficult to know how our story is going to unfold with time, but it's still a necessity that we obey God faithfully, right? His work can happen over years, through circumstances we could have never predicted, but we still need to obey him, and that is the challenge in 2 Kings chapter 8, how the Shunammite woman returns after 7 years from being away. We're going to see Hazael's shocking rise to power and the failures of Judah's kings, and I'm going to give you one practical action to help you trust God when his plan seems distant in this episode of Biblical Unlocks. This show is designed to help build your habit of reading the Bible, understanding the Bible, and applying it in your daily life. If you enjoy episodes like this, please consider following and rating the show. It's free, it helps you out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's get a little bit of context into the chapter. So, 2 Kings chapter 8 is bringing together several events that show God's providence over ordinary lives and international kingdoms. Elisha is warning the Shunammite woman to leave the land because a 7-year famine is coming, and after returning, she appeals to the king for the restoration of her house and land. And God providentially arranges for Gehazi to be telling the king about her story at exactly that moment. The chapter then shifts to Syria, where Ben-Hadad is sick, and sends Hazael to ask Elisha whether he will recover. Elisha then tells Hazael that the king is going to die, and that Hazael himself will become king of Syria, while foreseeing the suffering Hazael will inflict upon Israel. Finally, the chapter records the reign of Jehoram and Ahaziah of Judah, showing how their alliances with the house of Ahab draw Judah deeper and deeper and deeper into spiritual corruption. So let's read verses 1 to 15. The focus here is going to be the Shunammite woman who returns after 7 years, and we're going to see Elisha and Hazael. Verse 1. Now Elisha said to the woman whose son he had restored to life, "Get up and go with your household and settle wherever you can, for the Lord has called for a famine, and it will come on the land for 7 years." So the woman got up and did according to the word of the man of God. She went with her household and settled in the land of the Philistines 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, when the woman returned from the land of the Philistines, she set out to appeal to the king for her house and her land. Now the king was talking with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, saying, "Tell me all the great things that Elisha has done." While he was telling the king how Elisha had restored a dead person to life, the woman whose son he had restored to life appealed to the king for her house and her land. Gehazi said, "My lord king, here is the woman, and here is her son whom Elisha restored to life." When the king questioned the woman, she told him. So the king appointed an official for her, saying, "Restore all that was hers, together with all the revenue of the fields from the day that she left the land until now." Elisha went to Damascus while King Ben-Hadad of Aram was ill. When it was told him, "The man of God has come here," the king said to Hazael, "Take a present with you and go to meet the man of God. Inquire of the Lord through him, whether I shall recover from this illness." So Hazael went to meet him, taking a present with him, all kinds of goods of Damascus, 40 camel loads. When he entered and stood before him, he said, "Your son, King Ben-Hadad of Aram, has sent me to you, saying, 'Shall I recover from this illness?' Elisha said to him, 'Go, say to him, you shall certainly recover, but the Lord has shown me that he shall certainly die.' He fixed his gaze and stared at him to the point of embarrassment. Then the man of God wept. Hazael asked, 'Why does my Lord weep?' He answered, 'Because I know the evil that you will do to the people of Israel. You will set their fortresses on fire. You will kill their young men with the sword, dash in pieces their little ones, and rip up their pregnant women.' Hazael said, 'What is your servant, who is a mere dog, that he should do this great thing?' Elisha answered, 'The Lord has shown me that you are to be king over Aram.' Then he left Elisha and went to his master Ben-Hadad, who said to him, 'What did Elisha say to you?' And he answered, 'He told me that you would certainly recover.' But the next day He took the bed cover and dipped it in water and spread it over the king's face until he died. And Hazael succeeded him. All right, so we see in the first 6 verses that the Shunammite woman returns after 7 years. And that's because Elisha warns her that a famine is coming, and he told her to leave for 7 years. And this is an example of God's providence again, how it works. God is not removing the famine, but instead he gives his servant wisdom to navigate through it. And the woman responds by leaving and staying in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. So what that means is, again, sometimes trusting in God means listening to his warnings and taking the appropriate action. And after 7 years away, she returns, appeals to the king for the restoration of her house and land, and at first glance, she seems to be facing another uncertain situation, right? What if the king says no? But then Scripture gives another remarkable moment of providence, because at exactly the same time she arrives, Gehazi is speaking with the king about Elisha's miracle, and specifically the story about the Shunammite woman who just returned, and the Shunammite woman's son being restored to life. And Gehazi says, look, this is the woman is here. And the king grants her request. So that's the idea here, that the woman doesn't know that Gehazi will be talking about her, and Gehazi does not know she's about to arrive. And the king does not appear to have planned the conversation, yet everything lines up. God could be arranging an answer before we even know what question we need to ask. So, we need to trust again. The other thing here is that Elisha and Hazael are having a discussion, and Elisha begins to weep when he looks at Hazael because Elisha sees something Hazael doesn't actually understand yet. Hazael is going to become king of Syria or Aram, and he's going to bring terrible suffering upon Israel. And Elisha's tears, he starts weeping, he cries because there's something important about God's prophets. It's that knowing God's judgments does not make them emotionally detached. These guys are not psychopaths. They're human beings who struggle and feel sad about suffering. And Elisha proclaims God's truth while grieving the consequences of sin. And the other thing I would say here as well is that Hazael struggles to imagine himself doing the thing that Elisha predicts. He says, but what? What are you talking about? Right? He says, what is your servant, who is a mere dog, verse 13, that he should do this great thing, right? So the response that Hazael gives is, are you sure you're talking to the right person? Like, I'm that person who's going to do all of these terrible things? But what I think is fascinating and something that we need to understand is that we need God's grace because sin can distort our desires and actions in ways we do not initially anticipate. And Hazael receives the news that he will become king, and his rise is going to demonstrate that God remains sovereign over all nations and rulers. Because even though it seems like Hazael is making his own political decision, his rise occurs within the prophetic word spoken by Elisha. That is to say that Hazael's evil actions, they're not morally approved by God, but God remains sovereign even when human beings act wickedly. All right, now let's read verses 16 to 24. Focus here is going to be on Jehoram's reign in Judah. Verse 16, in the 5th year of King Joram, son of Ahab of Israel, Jehoram, son of King Jehoshaphat of Judah, began to reign. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. He walked in the way of the kings of Israel, as the house of Ahab had done, for the daughter of Ahab was his wife. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Yet the Lord would not destroy Judah for the sake of his servant David, since he had promised to give a lamp to him and to his descendants forever. In his days Edom revolted against the rule of Judah and set up a king of their own. Then Joram crossed over to Zair with all his chariots. He set out by night and attacked the Edomites and their chariot commanders who had surrounded him, but his army fled home. So Edom has been in revolt against the rule of Judah to this day. Libnah also revolted at the same time. Now the rest of the acts of Joram and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? So Joram slept with his ancestors and was buried with them in the city of David. His son Ahaziah succeeded him. Okay, so Jehoram walks in the ways of the kings of Israel and the house of Ahab, and his marriage alliance with Ahab's family draws Judah towards the same spiritual corruption that had plagued the northern kingdom. But the text gives us an important statement about why God does not completely destroy Judah, because God is faithful to his covenant with David. Judah's survival is not it's not a reward because Jehoram was righteous. No, it is an expression of God's faithfulness to his promise. And the other thing is, the chapter mentions Edom's rebellion against Judah, because Judah's political weakness is becoming visible. Edom, who was previously under Judah's control, rebels, establishes his own kingdom, and this illustrates the consequences of Judah's spiritual decline. The kingdom exists, but its influence is weakening and weakening. So what that suggests is spiritual compromise. When we give in to our sin, our temptation, it may not destroy everything immediately, but it gradually weakens what has been entrusted to us. Seemingly small compromises can gradually reshape our entire lives. Okay, let's read verses 25 to 29. Focus here is going to be on Ahaziah's reign over Judah. Verse 25. In the 12th year of King Joram, son of Ahab of Israel, Ahaziah, son of King Jehoram of Judah, began to reign. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, a granddaughter of King Omri of Israel. He also walked in the way of the house of Ahab, doing what was evil in the sight of the Lord, as the house of Ahab had done, for he was son-in-law to the house of Ahab. He went with Joram, son of Ahab, to wage war against King Hazael of Aram at Ramoth-Gilead, where the Arameans wounded Joram. King Joram returned to be healed in Jezreel of the wounds that the Arameans had inflicted on him at Ramah, when he fought against King Hazael of Aram. King Ahaziah, son of Jehoram of Judah, went down to see Joram, son of Ahab, in Jezreel because he was wounded. Okay, so let's take a look here. Ahaziah's relationship with the house of Ahab is significant because Ahaziah continues the pattern of unhealthy alliance with Israel's royal family. He is related to Ahab's house and he chooses to cooperate with them militarily. And the reason why, and the tragic result of this, is that he joins Joram of Israel in battle against Syria and eventually dies because of the conflict. So the chapter shows again another biblical theme, that who we align ourselves with can influence where our lives will eventually lead. So there is a deeper pattern running throughout this chapter. There are two very different kinds of relationships. The beginning of the chapter began with the Shunammite woman who trusts God's prophets and experiences God's providential care. Judah's kings repeatedly assign themselves with the house of Ahab and become increasingly corrupted. So one pattern is faithfulness and restoration, and the other one is compromise and destruction. So what influences are shaping the direction of your life? Let's see how this chapter fulfills Jesus Christ. Okay, so the providence of 2 Kings chapter 8 points towards the greater providence that is revealed in Jesus Christ. The Shunammite woman does not see how her story will unfold, yet God quietly arranges the circumstances for her restoration. In the Gospel, God's providence reaches its greatest expression with what appears to be the defeat of Jesus through the cross actually becomes the very means by which God accomplishes salvation, because the cross demonstrates that God can work through circumstances that appear completely contrary to his purposes. And the chapter also expresses humanity's need for a faithful king, because Jehoram and Ahaziah, they are corrupted by their alliances, and they fail to lead God's people faithfully. Yet, Christ, by contrast, is the perfectly faithful king who never compromises his allegiance to the Father, where Israel's kings, they are shaped by corruption and disastrous relationships. Jesus remains perfectly obedient even unto death. This is why we read in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, "We know all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose." 2 Kings chapter 8 teaches us that God's providence can be invisible, gradual, and difficult to understand. But Romans chapter 8 teaches us that even when we cannot see the pattern, God has not lost control of the story. All right, so in applying this chapter, we need to understand that there are things that are unseen, and we need to trust in that which is unseen. Even if we cannot see a way through, we shouldn't try to control every outcome. Instead, pray, "Lord, I cannot see what you are doing, but I trust that you are working." And then we focus on the next faithful step. And the other thing is, we need to check our influences. We see the influences that affect Ahaziah and Jehoram and all of these things, right? All of these kings. What we need to do is we need to check our influences. What music am I listening to that is influencing my behaviors? What content am I watching that is influencing my behavior? Are these drawing me closer to Christ or gradually pulling me away? And we need to make some adjustments. Alright, so we learned in this episode that faith can involve practical obedience to God's warnings, that God's providence works through seemingly ordinary circumstances, that God may be preparing an answer for us before we even see the need, that spiritual maturity should produce compassion within our lives, and that the failures of Judah's kings point us towards our need for Jesus Christ, who is the perfectly faithful King. And we need to watch our spiritual compromises, which often weaken us gradually. So that's it for this episode. Next time we're going to move to 2 Kings chapter 9, where Jehu is anointed king and launches a violent revolution against the house of Ahab. We're going to unpack God's judgments on Ahab's dynasty, the fulfillment of Elijah's prophecy, and the difficult question of how we understand divine judgment in Scripture. So, that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to rate the show and follow. It's free, it helps you out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Otherwise, just have a blessed day. And remember, if you're not in your word, you're in your feelings. Godspeed.